All right, we're going to just go ahead and dive in to this whole social problem business here. What you see up on the screen is the table of contents from your textbook. If you click on your textbook link, this is what you'll see. It's basically this massive PDF, I don't know, like 500 pages or something. And this is where we begin. What I'll basically be doing this very, very first presentation is going through, essentially, if you look at chapter 1 on the screen here, what is a social problem? That's all we're going to be covering in this first tape. It's actually pretty simple material, and it's just to kind of get some definitions out of the way. And this is the first slide of the notes, so you can also look at those as well. Basically what the notes do is they summarize and to some degree reorganize some of the material in the textbook. Especially here at the beginning, they track pretty closely. Sometimes when we get into other social problems, I take a slightly different approach than what is presented. You know, I have a PhD, which means that sort of gives me the right to do that. So, but you'll see where it connects. It's not that different. But at least in the beginning, we start in the same place. So essentially what this course is about is how the social sciences are used to talk about social problems. Now, this is kind of different than what you may have heard about the social sciences in other places. It is true that when the social sciences first began, and by the social sciences we mean psychology, anthropology, and sociology, so you'll want to keep those in mind. And some people include political science in there, but that wasn't originally a social science. But when the social sciences were first developed in the 19th century, almost 200 years ago now, not quite, but almost, it was thought that by applying the certain scientific techniques to problems in society, that we would be able to solve human problems in the same way that one might solve a technological problem. And there are still some people who kind of go that way on occasion, but most social scientists, if you press them to the wall, and even if you don't have to, they'll admit that mostly what they're interested in doing now is not so much solving human problems as it is trying to understand where human problems come from, and hopefully provide some tools whereby human beings can come to understand themselves in some way, so that if human problems can be solved, humans can do it. And this is part of what is called social constructionism. So whether any particular social scientists think it's possible to solve a human problem or not, they do basically still come at it from a social constructionist perspective, which is basically that in human society, humans create their problems and they have to solve them. Humans also create their own experience of themselves. So there's this presumption that human beings don't have a self that is autonomous, which kind of goes against sort of the American individualism, but you know, American individualism is sort of a myth. So it's the idea that American individualism is the idea that all of us just sort of stand alone like little atomic solids somewhere. And that's actually not what both biology and psychology tells us, and certainly not history. But the social scientists presume that human beings develop a sense of self over time by their interactions with others. You know, whether or not you believe in a soul or not, that's a completely different thing, or can be. It's a matter of how you experience yourself in the world. So humans create their problems in their experience of the self. And when this translates into social problems, what this means is that a social problem, however it's conceived or defined or experienced by people, these are things that human beings create. In other words, they're not created by God. They're not created by some kind of transcendental force. They're not created by something that is outside of us, you see. They're created by us. So in this regard, a social problem is not just something you don't like. For example, this pandemic that we're experiencing, the pandemic itself, the pathogen, the virus, is not necessarily in and of itself a social problem. You know, even if it was created in a lab, I don't happen to think it was because it doesn't need to be, but even if it was, it's a pathogen. And if you know human history, you know that throughout human history, humans have experienced these pandemics. Pandemics used to be a dime a dozen, frankly. You know, if you look at the life of George Washington, for example, he experienced numerous epidemics and pandemics in his life. And in fact, probably one of the most formative epidemics that he experienced was the great smallpox epidemic of 1776. That happened during, you know, that famous winter when he wintered with his soldiers in that fort where they were in over the winter. He basically was isolating his soldiers because he had purposely inoculated them with live smallpox in order to find out how many of them would survive that process, because actually you survived better that way than if you caught smallpox the regular way. And because there was a smallpox pandemic literally raging across North America at the time. Pandemics were a dime a dozen. At the time when George Washington died, he had like I don't know 5 illnesses, including a malaria that he had lived with for many, many years, because once you got malaria, you couldn't get rid of it at the time. So it was more common for people to be sick than for them to be well. So the only reason why this pandemic seems weird to us is because we haven't had anything like this in 100 years that has been this widespread. Why have we not had anything like this in 100 years? Because of modern medicine. It's really kind of that simple. So diseases in and of themselves are not necessarily social problems. They're natural disasters. Just like tsunamis and earthquakes and tornadoes, you know, the big storms. However, the way in which a population might respond to the challenge of a pandemic might indicate certain types of social problems, you see. So that's the difference. You can have an objective thing and yet have a subjective way in which that problem is handled. You know, an earthquake is not a social problem in and of itself. It's just a natural geological thing that happens in some parts of the world. Forcing certain people to live in places where earthquakes occur because they're not being allowed to live anywhere else. Now that could be a social problem. It depends. But social problems are negative effects that are generally agreed to be negative by a population, whether those negative effects are physical, psychological, or social in nature. So there are different types of social problems, and as you'll see as we go on in this, different groups of people will define social problems differently. Obviously, problems have to be seen before they can be solved, and not everybody sees problems the same way, which is the next thing we'll get to. Now, what social scientists try to do is, when they are looking at a social problem, something that has been defined as a social problem, they are going to try to take both the objective nature of the problem and the human subjective response to that problem into account. Let me give another example. The question of slavery. Now, obviously, in American history, the institution of slavery and the fact that, you know, it was with our nation before it was even a nation, has deeply and profoundly marked not only just simply the relationships between different groups of people, you know, those different groups of people that we call the races in the United States. But it has also profoundly marked the development of certain types of institutions, political institutions, whether they be, you know, the courts and prisons, or whether they be, you know, the legislature, either at the state or federal level, who we tend to listen to. It's obviously affected the development of the media and economic systems. It's even profoundly my brain is not working. It's even profoundly affected the development of religion in the United States. It is still the case that one of the most segregated times or moments in American society is Sunday morning, you know, for people who still go to church, because there still is a real divide in many parts of the country between, for example, where African Americans go to church and where a lot of white Americans go to church. So slavery has had a lot of really negative effects over time, which of course we can look at and see now in all kinds of ways. But in the late 19th century, slavery was seen differently. In the late 18th century, when slavery was pervasive and you had slave states, and we had, you know, our nation had just formed and accepted slavery into its fold, even though, you know, our documents said all men were created equal. For a lot of people, slavery was not a problem, and a lot of white people, slavery was not a problem. It was just a fact of life. It was called the old institution. It was called, you know, the Old South. All these names attached to it, because it was just the way it was. And it was only a problem when black people tried to get out of it, or white industrialists, who admittedly were often exploiting their workers in their factories, would sort of point their finger at people in the South, white people in the South, and say, see, you've got a problem, you enslaved people. So that was the only time for a lot of white people that slavery was a problem. Now, obviously, for the enslaved people, for the African Americans that were enslaved at the time, it was a big problem. They had to deal with it every single day, every single moment. So there's a difference in terms of how a problem is seen and what its objective harms may be. We can look back now and see the incredible objective harms and effects of the institution of slavery on every facet of American institutional life. It's impossible not to see it now. But at the time, you know, in the 18th and 19th centuries, before the Civil War, and even for a long time after it, it was impossible for a lot of white people in particular to see where there had been a problem. So that's what makes it difficult for social problems sometimes to gain traction in society. There are lots of industrialists today, and this started back in the 1940s and 1950s, who did not consider industrial chemicals, for example, to be a problem, even though many of these industrialists admitted that some of the industrial chemicals that were used to create, you know, plastics and all kinds of other things that are used in an industrial sense, can be carcinogenic and very harmful to humans, harmful to the environment. But, you know, it was thought, well, you know, we need our technological life. We need this new stuff. You know, we need to advance, and especially in the 1950s and 60s, we need to advance more quickly than the Soviet Union. We need to advance. So, you know, Americans as a whole were willing to sort of swallow and take that bitter pill, even though many, 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 many scientists told us even then that there were problems with this kind of way of seeing the world. So oftentimes human beings don't, social problems or the real effects, the objective effects of a social problem, don't really make themselves known until a large mass of people are affected by it. Until something affects you, a lot of times human beings will live in denial about that. And so what social scientists have to do is they have to take all of that into account. They have to take both the objective measure of a problem, something that's harmful physically, socially, politically, economically even. They have to take the objective measure of that and also look at how the perception of it is. Just because someone thinks something is a problem, it may or may not be. Now, there are also other types of problems that people think are problems, but may objectively not be problems. And this is where you get into certain kinds of conspiracy theories. I had a student not too long ago who, was a few years ago, I guess, who was writing a paper for me about a social problem. And he was trying to convince me that the metric system was a social problem. And the reason he was writing about the metric system is because he believed that we shouldn't use the metric system. And actually what it amounted to is he just didn't want to learn it. Well, the metric system is not a problem. It is not a social problem. Just because you don't like something does not mean it's a social problem. Just because you don't like wearing a mask in a pandemic does not mean it's a social problem. It means that you have a problem wearing a mask for whatever reason you have of wearing a mask, just because you don't, in other words, just because you don't like something doesn't mean it's a social problem. In order for it to be a social problem that's sort of worth studying, there has to be a mass of people that all agree that there is an issue, all right? And so if you look at the textbook, what you'll find is that the social problems that we talk about in this class are social problems that a lot of people have agreed on. In other words, our society as a whole has tended to decide that there are problems in these areas. So whether we're talking about poverty, racial and ethnic inequality, gender inequality, issues of sexual orientation and inequality, issues of age, issues of addiction, crime, other types of sexual behavior, the family, or how the family is changing, education, work in the economy, healthcare, urban problems, population and the environment, and war and terrorism. Obviously, we're not going to cover all these things. I'm showing you this so that when you think about the types of social problems you might want to talk about, you'll see that there's a lot of different options that you can look at. But all of these topics have gained enough currency in our society that they're considered social problems by at least a large number of people, and in many cases, the majority of people. So if you're looking at something like abortion, for example, abortion or the issue of abortion might be considered a social problem by two entirely different groups of people for completely different reasons. And you've probably heard the arguments. People who are against abortion, who are anti-choice, they think abortion's a problem because it occurs. And individuals who are pro-choice believe that the issue of abortion, or the inability to have access to one if one needs it, that's the problem, because there are some instances in which abortion might be necessary. And obviously there are all kinds of possible positions in there, whether or not people believe that all abortion is wrong categorically, even in cases of incest or rape, or those people who will make an exception for certain medical things. There can be religious objections, like, for example, a lot of people don't know that in Judaism, for example, if a woman, if her pregnancy is threatening her life, that Jewish law actually mandates that she get an abortion, because a fully vested human life is considered to be more important than a life that is not yet born. And that's traditional Judaism. So, I mean, a lot of people don't know that there are a lot of different kinds of ways in which a topic like this might be addressed or might be approached. So that if a person considers abortion to be a problem, for example, it's always important to ask that person, is it that the possibility of abortion is the problem, or are unwanted pregnancies the problem? Because if unwanted pregnancies are the problem, then there are actually ways to solve that do not even involve things like abstinence, which people don't do anyway, So when you're asking people about, their stances towards some of these positions, what you find is that a lot of those positions can be nuanced in certain ways. But people may consider the general topic of abortion to be an issue of social problem worth, if you want to put it that way. There are obviously people who don't consider certain problems that are objective problems to be problems, like, for example, climate change. I've met people who acknowledge that climate change is probably happening. My brother is one of these people. But he doesn't think it's necessarily that important. Yeah, it's happening. We're trashing the planet, but, we'll survive, and the planet will survive because the planet's too big for us to kill it. That's kind of the way he looks at it. So there is, in his case, even the acknowledgement of a problem, but he doesn't think that it's worthy of us, worrying too much about. And as I mentioned, there are also social problems which may be considered problems in some cultures or time periods, but not others, even if real effects occurred. So, for example, in China right now, China is, and you may or may not know this, but for the past several years, and it's been going on now for a good 4 to 5 years, China for several years now has been rounding up and putting into essentially what are concentration camps large numbers of an ethnic minority that they consider to be a problem in the western part of the country, a group of people called Uyghurs. And the excuse for putting them in concentration camps has been because they're afraid of terrorism among the Uyghurs, because the Uyghurs happen to be a Muslim population, and they've been Muslims for, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years now, almost 1,000 years, I think. And the real issue, of course, we know is economic, is because the Uyghurs are sort of semi-autonomous. They're kind of out there on the edges of Chinese civilization, and their native lands, or their indigenous lands where they happen to be right on top of large areas that are rich in heavy metals that the Chinese need for computers and stuff, for technology. And the Uyghurs have been unwilling to just simply give it up, or unwilling to become Chinese enough to offer it up, that kind of thing. So, they're going to try to destroy the Uyghur population. From the Chinese perspective, the Uyghurs are the social problems. When we look at something like this, we would say, oh, the Chinese government is the social problem, you see. And so, now, that being said, please don't take me to mean that sociologists or social scientists are just automatically themselves supposed to be objective about these things. We're not objective about these things. I'm certainly not objective about these things. I'm an American. I was raised a certain way. I have certain values that I hold dear to my heart, and I think those values will probably make themselves clear as I go through these presentations. And these are certainly things we can talk about in our discussions, in our Zoom sessions. So social scientists, in and of themselves, are not necessarily objective people. The social sciences at one time were considered to be hopefully more objective, and there are certain ways of putting together studies, which I'll show you in the next couple weeks, where more objectivity can be attained, all right? Especially when we get to like terror management theory, and I actually am able to show you ways in which that actually works, how social science work is actually done. But as human beings, we're certainly not objective in any way. But what we can do is we can understand that there are other perspectives. We can come to understand what another person's perspective is. And this is what is called social imagination. So let me get to that. And this is probably one of the more powerful and useful things that hopefully you might be able to learn out of this course. And this is what the social imagination is and how you can use it. The social imagination entails a number of different things. First of all, it helps you to understand how social problems emerge. How do various social problems come to be? What are the social forces, the political forces, the economic forces that create the conditions out of which social problems emerge? So learning, and part of that is a historical process. So it does help if you know a little bit of history and how societies work, or how, here we are and this is how we got there. I mean, that does help. The social imagination also assists you as an individual in understanding what your part is in social problems. How do you contribute to it? What part do you play in it? Are you even aware that what you do on an everyday basis is actually affecting hundreds of people all the time? I mean, I'm sitting here recording this video into my machine. I'm alone in my room. It's kind of hot in my room. You can probably see behind me and see all these books and this crap in my room. But in order for me to even do this, there are unseen people, unknown people, hundreds of people who are making sure that I have electricity, who are making sure that that all of the equipment and the software and, into the internet and all that kind of stuff is working, that I'm just completely unaware of, including all the people who built this machine, who envisioned this machine, who envisioned even the possibility of me being able to record myself in this way, transform it into a form that could be preserved so that you could watch it. I mean, I don't even know how many people that takes ultimately to do all of that kind of stuff, all right? If there's a social problem in any of that, then I'm connected to all those people that are participating in that. If my use of this electricity ultimately turns out to be a social problem, and I'm destroying part of the planet by doing this, then, what we're doing right here is part of the problem, So part of the social imagination is learning the part that you play, and not in a guilty way. I mean, guilt doesn't really help. You can't solve any problems with guilt. You have to be able to just simply see where you're sitting at any given time. The other part of the social imagination is seeking to understand or at least appreciate the experiences of others. And this is actually really important, because I think that this is really hard for some people. I think that this is a real part of some of the social unrest that we see in some groups, not in Black Lives Movement, for example, but Black Lives Matter movement, for example, but in in some people who are really, really having difficulty with grokking the reality of the pandemic. It's very difficult sometimes, I think, for some people to understand how what they do affects others. They don't want to believe, I think, that they're that powerful. They don't want to believe that that they're connected to others in that way. And that's part of that idea that, we in America, that we're all individuals and we all have our rights and we all, and that's what we like to believe, in certain ways. But actually, that's not reality. It's not the way we actually live. We are fundamentally dependent and interdependent on each other for food, for the gasoline in our cars, for, like I said, the electricity in our houses. I mean, how many of you make your own clothes? I mean, seriously, make all of your own clothes. How many of you actually have created and made all of the technology that you have around you? Maybe one or two of you have done some of it, but most of you haven't. We're connected to all these people. Do you understand these people's experiences? Do you know who these people are? Well, of course you don't, because we live in a world that really doesn't permit that. So part of the social imagination that social scientists attempt to get a handle on is trying to understand the experience of other people. And that's part of the reason why, for example, I'm not going to be making fun of people who are having difficulty with this pandemic. I happen to have some relatives that are like this. I happen to have a brother who, like I mentioned, not only does he believe that climate change is real but doesn't matter, but he doesn't think that this pandemic is all that. And it's just because the place that he lives in the country hasn't had that many cases yet. And you'd think he'd know better because he's a medical doctor, but there you go. He lives in a very small world. And he does. He lives in a very rural area, very small world. And so it's very, very difficult for him to really get a sense of how other people in other places live. It's easy for him to forget. So learning how to relate to other people is a fundamental part of what this is, because if you can understand your part in a social problem and try to at least understand where someone else is coming from, then you can start to see how our individual experiences are connected to the greater whole of our lives. Now, does that solve problems? Well, sometimes it does. No great social movement has ever begun without that experience, okay? Great social events like, the elimination of slavery or the civil rights movement or even the American Revolution, which, by the way, most Americans in the colonies did not sign on to at first. Only about a third of the population, when our founding fathers, or whatever we call them, signed the Declaration of Independence. Only about a third of American colonists signed on to that at first. It took a while for people to come around. So that's what it takes, though. If problems are going to be solved, first people have to come around. It has to be recognized as a problem. You have to convince a number of people that there is a problem that needs to be solved. But before you can do that, you have to see how we're all connected. And that's probably one of the more powerful things that the social sciences can give you. Even if anthropology and sociology can't really solve your problem, socially, or, you go to a psychologist and, if they're a clinical psychologist, they may be able to give you some good therapy, but, they can't make your decisions for you. So, there are limits to what social scientists can do, but they can help you see. And so hopefully that is what this class can help with, is to help you see yourself, help you to see others. And maybe somewhere in there, I don't know that we can come to any solutions or any conclusions, but hopefully you'll find something in this class that will help you feel a little bit more equipped to deal with the absolute craziness that is happening outside and sometimes inside of our homes. So that's the very first part of what we're doing. Now, if you look to see how this is connected to the textbook, what you'll see is what is a social problem. First, it defines the social problem, and you'll notice here that the definition is very similar to what I gave you. It's a condition or behavior that has negative consequences for large numbers of people and that is generally recognized as a condition or behavior that needs to be addressed. This definition has both an objective component and a subjective component. So it talks a little bit about objective and subjective components. And then it talks about the social constructionist view, essentially. And it gives a few examples. So for example, right here, according to some sociologists, when is a social problem a social problem? According to some sociologists who adopt this view, negative conditions and behaviors are not social problems unless they are recognized as such by policymakers, large numbers of lay citizens, or other segments of our society. So these sociologists would thus say that rape and sexual assault before the 1970s was not a social problem because our society as a whole paid them little attention. Other sociologists say that negative conditions and behaviors should be considered a social problem even if they receive little or no attention. Thus, these sociologists would thus say that rape and sexual assault before the 1970s were a social problem, but they just weren't recognized as such, all right? So it talks quite a bit about social constructionism, and I would like you to think about that, what you think about that. Do you think that there are problems before we recognize them, or are problems not problems until we recognize them? And we'll talk about the natural history of a social problem a little bit later. But a couple of questions that might be useful for you. What do you think is the most important social problem facing our nation right now? Just think about that. And then what I asked, do you agree with the social constructionist view that a negative social condition or behavior is not a social problem unless there is a perception that it should be considered one? I personally, and I'll just tell you my opinion, I personally think that a problem is a problem, even if it's not considered one. It's a problem. But I will acknowledge that probably nothing's going to be done about it until it is recognized as one. And that's where we get into the next part of this, which is what is the social life of a social problem. So I hope that this gives you a good introduction to the course and where we're going to be started. So what I would suggest you do is continue on with whatever videos I've uploaded and keep in mind where we are during the week. This is all for the first week. And make sure that you've looked at everything for week one. And I will see you at discussion.